Hey, welcome to our Old Testament 102 class. And we have been going through the different stages of the Old Testament. And we have, the last couple of weeks, we have looked at the United Kingdom under King Saul and King David and Solomon. Last week, we talked about the divided kingdom, and we see Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, becomes king, and he has discussions with Jeroboam that don't go so well, that end up splitting Israel into two. We have the northern tribes, which Jeroboam will lead, and then we have the southern tribes, which Rehoboam will lead. And this causes civil war within God's community, the Israelite people. We have Israel will be known as the northern kingdom. Judah will be known as the southern kingdom. And of course, sadly, the northern kingdom was taken off into captivity by the Assyrians, and that they never returned to the land. The southern kingdom, they are taken off into captivity by the Babylonians. They do eventually return to the land on several different occasions. And so today, what we want to focus on is we want to focus on really two books, two people that depict somewhat of this captivity of Judah. And so we want to be looking at the prophet Ezekiel and also the prophet Daniel and the books that they are part of. So we will we'll turn to our lesson here, and let's go ahead and pull this up. There we go. So we have what we call the captivity stage, and so this covers the fall of the southern kingdom in 605, and then roughly to 538 BC. And so again, we said that these books are, or we're mainly focused on two books, Ezekiel and Daniel. This stage begins with the capture of the southern kingdom, Judah, by the Babylonians, and then ends with the decree of Cyrus, allowing the return of the exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem. And we'll see that in people like Ezra and Nehemiah. And so Psalm 137 describes the beginning of this stage, and Psalm 126 describes the end. And so some of the key people, some of the key characters that we have during this stage are Daniel, of course, and then Daniel's was with or under Nebuchadnezzar when he was in Babylon. And then we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Belshazzar, Darius, and then, of course, Ezekiel. So we'll be talking about the deliverance of Daniel and his friends from out of Israel, or I'm sorry, Judah. Talk about a little bit about the destruction of the first temple, and then we will also focus on some of Daniel as far as the prophecies concerning the Gentile world. The book of Daniel really speaks into a lot of what, not just future things or even things in the far, far future, but speak into kingdoms that will be in power, and also then the final kingdom that will set itself up to rule for eternity, which we as Christians know that as the kingdom of Jesus. So we, some of the key locations, obviously, Babylon, the destruction of the temple there in Jerusalem, and then we have Daniel as he speaks into the Gentile world, and also Ezekiel. Ezekiel is just one of the strangest books I find in the Old Testament, but there's so much there, and there's also a lot of hope in that book as well. And so we have both Ezekiel and Daniel in captivity in Babylon, and so they write their experiences, but they also write what God places on their hearts. And so so we will start with that. We want to start with Ezekiel, and so Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet. He was also the son of a priest, and taken to Babylon in 597 BC with Jehoiachin. He began his ministry at 30, and he lived in Babylon on the Shabar, a canal that flowed from the Euphrates River. And Ezekiel reminds us that the captives were in Babylon because of their sin. And we've talked about this in class before, but God, when land is desecrated, the pattern that we see in the Bible is that God removes people from the land with the hopes of returning them to the land. You know, we have that starting in the garden, right? Adam and Eve are removed from the land, and eventually mankind will go to a new heavens and a new earth that is a picture of a garden as well. But we have Israel and Judah, as far as gone off into captivity, removed from the land, and then also to come back. And so that story just continues to flow through the scriptures. And Ezekiel is a book that reminds us of what sin has done. And also, I find in Ezekiel some of the most exciting chapters that God is up to something. He's going to restore and renew different things. And so we talk about false prophets told the Jews in Jerusalem and Babylon that God would not destroy Jerusalem. That was every time the kings would look for a prophet, like, hey, the Babylonians, what are they going to do? And so a lot of times the false prophets would say, we're going to be fine. God's going to defeat these enemies. But Ezekiel spoke up a hard truth. And I think sometimes that is a call for us as well as Christians, that we need to share those hard truths as well. Ezekiel, in his book, there's 12 symbolic acts. First, he drew a map of Jerusalem with the enemy camps and weapons in place. And then he placed an iron plate between the map and himself. And this showed the Babylonian army was immovable. So this idea that somehow the Israelites or the Jews were going to overcome Babylon was really, Ezekiel was saying, no, it's not going to happen. And so you need to trust me. God is using Babylon for judgment. There's also a time where he laid on his left side for 390 days to stand for the sin of the northern kingdom. And so each day stood for 1 year in the kingdom. Ezekiel then lays on his side for 40 days to stand for the sin of the southern kingdom. And so Ezekiel is portraying why they're going to go into captivity and what's going on. One time the prophet made bread from mixed grains and baked it over dried cow dung. Doesn't sound exciting, but this was to show that there was little food in Jerusalem. And Ezekiel shaved his head one time and beard with a sword, and he divided the hair into 3 equal parts, and he burned 1/3 of the hair, and he cut up the other third with a sword, and he scattered the final third in the wind. And this showed what was coming to Judah and Jerusalem. 1/3 of the people would die by fire, right? There's going to be an invasion by the Babylonians. Another third would die by sword, and then the remaining would scatter and go into captivity. Another symbol within the book is he clapped his hands, stamped his feet to gain attention. And another symbol, Ezekiel set just a few pieces of baggage outside his home, and then he dug an entrance through the city wall, and he went through the entrance covering his face. Ezekiel is really a very creative preacher. and God used him to show that the exiles would leave their homes in a hurry. The entrance in the wall represented their need to leave Jerusalem. And so Ezekiel is using all kinds of different techniques. He trembled as he ate his food and rationed out his water as if there would be no more. Again, there's this idea that Ezekiel is trying to portray a picture that doom and destruction is coming. Ezekiel slashed the air with a gleaming sword and cried out as he beat his thigh. And another time, he drew a map with 2 routes for the king of Babylon to follow. One led to Jerusalem, the other to Rabath Ammon. Both cities had rebelled against Babylon. Ezekiel filled a pot with choice meats and boiled it until the meat fell off the bones. And then he dumped the pot's content and waited for the pot to bake itself dry, removing all the rust and scum. And this spoke into judgment that God was bringing, that he would consume everyone, and even the rich and noble in Jerusalem. No one would be allowed to stay in the land. God is going to remove people from the land. And then God told Ezekiel not to show any outward sadness over the death of his wife, which, imagine that you're not allowed to mourn. But this was a picture that he was portraying, that this showed God would not mourn over the death of Jerusalem. God's special people, they were to be a blessing to the world, and they were not. And so God is not going to mourn, and he asks Ezekiel not to mourn as well. Ezekiel then delivers 12 judgment messages. God had held back his judgment in spite of Israel's disobedience. God took no joy in judging his people and still called for them to repent. And so this is the preaching side of Ezekiel. Because God did not listen, because Judah did not listen, God would soon judge them. Judah is going to be destroyed because of their sin and their present generation, not because of their father's sin. The idea that the sins are passed on to the generations, that is more of an idea that we mimic what we see. But one thing that God wants us to be clear is that we're being judged not because of what somebody else did in the past, but we're being judged because of our own actions. And so even the presence of godly men like Noah and Daniel and Job would not stop God's judgment of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's armies would not be able to defend the city, and its wealth would do no good in preventing its destruction. And so the city once belonged to God, but in a sense, it now becomes Satan's reign in this territory. Now, the good news is the hope, and something that Ezekiel brings out in his book, is that God is going to do something to bring life back into his people. And certainly we see images of Jesus as he confronts Satan in the wilderness, that Satan believes that he has control of the world, but ultimately Jesus is going to bring him to his knees. And God would bring the worst nations and peoples to Judah to occupy his people's homes, which was a sad thing. What was meant for good, God had to judge now. And so Judah's cities are going to be destroyed, and the idols destroyed within them. So we're going to have war and famine and plagues, and this is going to come upon the citizens of Judah. And so as you can see, that Ezekiel is painting a picture that is not a very joyful picture. Well, there's also some parables that he told. One of the parables described a fruitless vine tree that was burned because it refused to do a single thing, and it was created to do. And so, that vine stood for Israel, that God's people. They were meant to flourish. They were meant to be a blessing to the world, and they were not. And there was hostility towards God and his people. And Ezekiel spoke judgment on other nations and cities. And so some of those, Ammon, God had Ezekiel preach against Ammon because they took joy in Jerusalem's destruction. This wasn't something to take joy in. This wasn't something to be happy about. Even though God was using Babylon to do this destructive stuff. This was not something to be happy about. Moab treated God like any other local idol, and as a result, the same tribes that took over Ammon also would take over Moab cities, and so they're going to be judged. And then Tyre also took in joy in the fall of Judah to Babylon, and because they had a history of selling Jews as slaves. And Tyre was the great commercial city within Old Testament times, and Tyre was two cities together. One was on the Mediterranean, and the other was an island about a mile away. And God's judgment on Tyre was that both locations would be destroyed and never rebuilt. Then we have Ezekiel. He speaks about the differences between false shepherds and the only one true shepherd. And of course, that's going to lead into Jesus. And so the great shepherd is one who protects his sheep. And we see Ezekiel talking about the shepherd metaphor and this idea. And certainly we can see Jesus in this, and especially, as Jesus would search out the lost, he delivers us from our enemies. He gathers people from all nations. He feeds on the mountain of Israel. He gives them green pastures. He binds their wounds. He heals the sick. He promises their safety. So all the imagery that Ezekiel gives points to this coming time in history. So we have doom and destruction within this time of captivity. But Ezekiel also paints, again, we don't want to miss the fact that Ezekiel paints a picture of hope. And so God removed Israel out of the promised land because of their sin, and Ezekiel told the exiles that God's plan was to restore the nations of Israel. God was going to do that. And Ezekiel's chapter 36 and 37 may be some of my favorite chapters in all of Ezekiel. And it's this valley of dry bones, and Ezekiel's looks at this. And, if you think about it, Israel, God's people are defeated. It's like death has come in, which it has. There's this death, and there's these dry bones. And who can bring these dry bones back to life? Well, of course, nobody can except God. And so God is going to breathe life into these dry bones. And this is a beautiful picture of the resurrection. And especially as Christians, we hold on to that's what's going to happen, that even because of sin that has brought death into our own lives, Jesus has conquered sin and he's conquered death. He's going to bring life into our bones. We're going to be a new creation, part of a new world of new heavens and new earth. And so God leads Ezekiel to paint this picture of a restored Israel. Now, Jews are still looking for a restored Israel, but we know through the scriptures and through Jesus the Messiah that God is doing this restored Israel through Jesus, so that when Paul says that all Israel will be saved, he's not talking about a little country there in the Mediterranean, right off the Mediterranean water, but he's talking about this kingdom of Jews and Gentiles, a new people that will create a new heaven on earth. And so it's just a beautiful picture that Ezekiel paints, and just some neat things. Let's talk about Daniel here. As a teenager, Daniel was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. This was in the first Babylonian assault, which is in 605, and Daniel lived without compromising his faith. And Daniel, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Daniel while in captivity. And I think those even speak into our own age and time. How do we live as a people called out while in a different world, right? And so we see that. And Daniel would serve with excellence under three different kings: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. Daniel was known for his wisdom and his righteousness. He was known for his ability to interpret dreams. And so his first test of faith in Babylon is when he and his three friends are called off to the king. The way that the Babylonians would work, they would take some of the peoples, the best leaders within the groups that they captured, and they would basically raise them up in Babylonian thought. And one of the first things that they did is that they wanted Daniel and his friends to eat from the king's table, and as a way, really in a way of as in protest, to say, hey, listen, I know that this is the way the Babylonians do it, and this is what you think will happen, but we are a different people, and even in captivity, we're going to live like God's people. And of course, Daniel is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego now putting their lives in danger, and yet God works in that as they stand up against the king. During that time also, Nebuchadnezzar has some troubling dreams. His court officials can't answer those dreams, and the king is going to sentence them to death. But Daniel speaks up, and Daniel explains the dreams. And one of the dreams that he explains is that the king had seen a huge statue of a man, and it was of gold. His chest and arms were of silver, its belly, thighs were brass, and its legs were iron, and his feet part iron and clay. And so a rock falls on this statue and turns it into powder, and the rock grew until it filled the earth. And so Daniel interprets the dream. The statue seems to stand for 4 Gentile nations of power, and some have debated a little bit what all these nations are, but we'll just give a general overview. The first would have certainly been Babylon, which was dominating the area at that time. That would have been the golden head. The silver chest and arms, Persia, and maybe even the Medes. The brass belly and thighs, probably Greece, which defeated the Persians and then dominated the world from 331 to 323. And then the iron legs and iron clay feet were Rome, which defeated Greece and became a world power. And so in the days of the final world power, God would crush every earthly kingdom through his rock, Jesus, and set up an eternal kingdom. And so Daniel was pointing to that these kingdoms of the world really are working in folly, because God is going to bring a kingdom that's going to last forever. And so ultimately, that's a reminder to you and I that we, no matter what system we're in, whether we're in Liberia, Nepal, or the United States, our political leaders are part of a failing system that Jesus is seeking to dominate, and we're not meant to become like our systems. So Nebuchadnezzar would fall down and worship Daniel when he heard this interpretation, and then he promoted Daniel and his friends. And but then King Nebuchadnezzar, he makes this golden image of himself. He sets up the image on the plains. He's going to have everybody worship to him. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, no, we're not going to do it. And so Nebuchadnezzar doesn't like when people defy his orders. And they go into a fiery furnace, and it doesn't consume them. And they stand for their faith. Now, they could have died. They could have lost their faith. But again, God calls his people, even in foreign cultures, he calls them to stand for the kingdom. Another time, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream of a mighty and beautiful tree that everyone could see, and it provided fruit for the whole world, and shade and protection for the animals and birds. And there was a heavenly figure that came and ordered the tree cut down and its fruit scattered. And the tree's stump was all that was left, and it had a band of iron and brass around it. So Daniel interprets this dream for Nebuchadnezzar. The tree stood for Nebuchadnezzar. The heavenly visitor was an angel of the Most High. The destruction of the tree was not total. The band around the trunk meant that the tree might grow again, and God could still have purpose for Nebuchadnezzar. And so God's even working with the pagan kings of the world, but he's not working to expand their kingdoms or their programs. He's working to move history towards Jesus and his kingdom. But Nebuchadnezzar still spoke proudly of his accomplishments. And after a year after this dream, he became insane in his dream um, that he described. And, we get this crazy thing where he lives as an animal for 7 years, and he's eventually restored when he's humbled. Belshazzar, who ruled Babylon together with his father, gave a feast for his top 1,000 officers. And as the night went on, Belshazzar ordered that the gold cup and silver cups from Jerusalem's temple be brought to the feast so the guests could use them to drink and honor the Babylonian gods and offer a toast. And so Belshazzar calls for Daniel. He offers him the third highest position in Babylon to Daniel. Daniel interprets the writing on the wall because there's this vision that he has about this hand. And Daniel begins to remind Belshazzar the pride that nearly destroyed his grandfather is going to destroy him. And Daniel interprets the writing that's been on the wall. And so the first word was me, which meant that God had numbered the days of Babylon and those that were coming to an end. Tekel meant that God had measured Belshazzar according to his standards, and Belshazzar had not met up to God's standards. Upharsin meant that Babylon was divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so ultimately, at the end of the night, Belshazzar is killed, and Darius the Mede took over as the ruler in Babylon. So Daniel is one of three presidents Darius appointed to supervise the 129 governors in Babylon. And Daniel was doing his job so well that Darius was thinking about promoting Daniel above the other two presidents. The other officials plotted against Daniel, and they end up tricking Darius into signing an order that made it illegal to pray to anyone but Darius. And the story goes that Daniel was found praying, so he's thrown in a lion's den. God shuts the mouth of the lions, and God is faithful to take care of Daniel. Daniel has a vision then that told about a godless kingdoms and God's kingdom. And in this vision, Daniel sees 4 beasts. And this is out of Daniel chapter 7. Daniel has another vision. The vision involved horns that represented Gentile nations and their leaders. And so we begin to see this work out. And so God reminds the people of Israel that they are not just going to be in captivity what they thought was 70 years, but that time is going to be extended because there's more that they need to learn. And Daniel confesses both national sins and his own as he prayed. He prayed that God would bring his people out of Babylon as he brought them out of Egypt, that God would forgive, and that God would permit the temple to be built again in Jerusalem. And it won't be too much longer that the temple, the second temple, will be built in Jerusalem. But ultimately, the temple was just a temporary thing because God was going to build a new temple, and that temple was us. There's stuff where Daniel warns about the Antichrist. This person will be totally self-willed. He'll lift himself up, put down God. He will prosper, believe for a while. He would not honor the gods of his fathers, and he would have no desire for women. He would honor the gods of the fortress. He would be attacked by 2 southern and northern kings. He would occupy the Holy Land in Egypt. He would hear frightening news in Egypt. He would return to the Holy Land to wage war, and he would be destroyed by Christ on Mount Zion. What I want to say about that is we want to be careful that we don't just read in some bad end times theology in this. Most of those events probably speak of the time when the Greek rulers came in, and they desecrated the temple, And so God is going to act in that. And so ultimately, the Christ is going to be King and Lord. And when Jesus comes into the world, he is declared King. That's the four Gospels are focused on Jesus as King. That God's kingdom has come in. So that is the end of the captivity stage. And so there's just a lot there, but hopefully this has given you at least somewhat of an overview. Until next time, God bless, and keep growing and walking in your faith.